The mid-afternoon sun bore down on the quiet suburban bank, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Inside, the air was stale with the scent of paper and polished floors. For most, it was a routine stop, a place to deposit checks or withdraw cash. For one elderly man, however, it would become an ordeal he wouldn't soon forget. But before we proceed further, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe. The old man shuffled in with measured steps, his cane tapping softly against the tiles. His movements were deliberate, his age evident in the slowness of his gait and the slight tremor in his hands. His clothing was neat but well-worn, the kind that spoke of a life lived modestly. He approached the counter with a small envelope clutched tightly, perhaps containing a check or some important paperwork. The scene took a sharp turn when the staff seemed to take umbrage at the time he was taking. What began as a few annoyed glances quickly escalated. The employees' voices grew terse, their words clipped and impatient. One teller leaned over the counter, whispering to a colleague while throwing irritated glances at the man. He didn't seem to notice. He was too busy fumbling with his envelope, trying to extract a piece of paper with trembling fingers. Eventually, the tension snapped. A burly security guard appeared, his presence more intimidating than welcoming. Without much preamble, the guard approached the man and motioned toward the exit. The elderly man looked confused, his brows furrowing as he tried to process what was happening. The guard spoke again, louder this time, and gestured more forcefully. The man hesitated, his frailty evident in the way he clutched his cane and looked around for support. What happened next was a mixture of absurdity and cruelty. The staff made no effort to help the man gather his things or understand the situation. Instead, the guard, with surprising indifference, escorted him to the door. The old man tried to protest, his voice cracking under the weight of his frustration and embarrassment. But his words fell on deaf ears. As he was guided, more like shoved, out the door, a few customers looked on, some with sympathy, others with discomfort. Nobody stepped forward. Perhaps they were too stunned or unwilling to intervene. The elderly man stood outside the bank, bewildered and humiliated. The humiliation seemed to sap his energy, leaving him slouched and defeated. His cane wobbled slightly as he steadied himself, clearly unsure of what to do next. Inside, the staff resumed their work as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. To them, it was just another minor inconvenience removed. What they didn't know was that fate had a different plan for that day. A tall, imposing figure was pulling into the parking lot, his massive frame crammed into the driver's seat of a luxury SUV. The vehicle screeched to a halt, and out stepped Shaquille O'Neal, the NBA legend himself. His presence was impossible to miss, 7 feet of sheer muscle, charisma, and a personality as big as his stature. Shaq had come to the bank on some personal business, but as he approached the entrance, he spotted the elderly man standing outside. The old man's hunched posture and the look of distress on his face caught Shaq's attention immediately. There was no hesitation. Shaq altered his course and strode directly toward him. "Hey, Pops, you okay?" His deep voice carried concern, but it was laced with a casual warmth that put people at ease. The old man looked up, startled, and for a moment, it seemed as though he wasn't sure if he was imagining things. Standing before him was one of the most recognizable figures in the world, offering a kindness he hadn't expected. The man stammered out his story, explaining the treatment he had just endured. Shaq listened intently, nodding occasionally but never interrupting. As the story unfolded, his expression shifted from concern to a smoldering anger. His jaw clenched and his massive hands curled into loose fists at his sides. By the time the old man finished, Shaq's mind was made up. "Wait here," he said, his voice firm but reassuring. Then, like a storm brewing on the horizon, he turned and marched toward the bank's doors. Inside, the atmosphere shifted the moment Shaq entered. Conversations hushed, heads turned, and even the security guard who had escorted the elderly man outfroze mid-step. Shaq didn't need to raise his voice. His very presence demanded attention. He walked straight to the counter, his towering frame making the staff look like schoolchildren in comparison. "What happened to the man outside?" he asked, his tone calm but carrying an edge that could cut through steel. The teller he addressed faltered, her practiced customer service smile faltering under his gaze. She fumbled for words, but Shaq wasn't interested in excuses. "You all thought it was okay to treat him like that," he continued, his voice growing louder. "That's someone's grandfather. That's someone who deserves respect." The staff exchanged nervous glances, their earlier bravado replaced with visible discomfort. The security guard, who had been leaning against the wall moments ago, now looked as though he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. Shaq's words cut through the air like a judge delivering a verdict, leaving no room for argument. To make his point even clearer, Shaq demanded to see the manager. When the manager emerged, looking both nervous and defensive, Shaq wasted no time laying into him. He didn't shout, but the weight of his words made it clear he was not to be trifled with. He spoke of dignity, humanity, and the responsibility of businesses to treat every customer with respect, regardless of their age or appearance. The staff stood by, pale and silent, as Shaq delivered his impromptu lecture. It was a sight to behold. One of the most famous athletes in the world standing up for a man who had been cast aside. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Here was a man who could have ignored the situation, gone about his day without a second thought. Instead, he chose to intervene, using his influence and sheer presence to right a wrong. When Shaq finally left the bank, he found the elderly man still waiting outside. The old man looked up as Shaq approached, his expression a mix of gratitude and disbelief. Shaq clapped a hand on his shoulder, the gesture both comforting and reassuring. "Come on, Pops," he said with a smile. "Let's get you taken care of." Shaq walked him back into the bank, his arm a protective barrier around the man's shoulders. The staff, still visibly shaken, scrambled to assist the elderly man this time, their earlier indifference replaced with obsequiousness. The scene was almost comical in its absurdity, as tellers tripped over themselves to offer apologies and expedite the man's transaction. Throughout it all, Shaq stood by the man's side, his presence a silent reminder that someone was watching. The old man, for his part, seemed to regain some of his dignity. His shoulders straightened, his voice grew steadier, and by the time he left the bank, he looked like a different person. As they exited the building, Shaq escorted the man to his car, making sure he was settled before saying goodbye. The old man thanked him profusely, his voice tinged with emotion. Shaq waved it off, flashing a grin that was as genuine as it was disarming. "Take care of yourself, Pops," he said before heading back to his SUV. The event would be remembered by everyone who witnessed it, not just for the drama of the confrontation, but for the humanity that Shaq displayed. It wasn't every day that someone of his stature and fame took the time to stand up for a stranger. And yet, in that moment, he wasn't a basketball legend or a celebrity. He was just a man doing what was right. The bank staff learned a harsh lesson that day about the power of kindness and the consequences of its absence. As for the elderly man, he left with more than his dignity intact. He left with a story he would tell for the rest of his days, one where an unlikely hero stepped in when he needed it most. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more engaging content. We thrive on your feedback, so be sure to leave your thoughts in the comments section below. Until next time, keep discovering and stay tuned.